Hello students, this is the video lecture that I'm doing for chapter 9 from the textbook about regulation of electronic media. And I'm walking, it's a Sunday morning, I think it's around 9, it's actually about a little bit after 9. I'm walking up a hill, I'm already breathing heavy, Runyon Canyon in Los Angeles. Maybe some of y'all know where that is. It's above Franklin. There's some big fancy homes around here. Anyway, I've done this walk a couple of times. I usually don't go all the way to the top of the little hill mountain there, but that's what I'll try and do today. So the little interstitial shot in between the video lecture on chapter 9 is Professor Arsenault walking up Runyon Canyon, and I feel a little intimidated because there's people with very LA physiques, meaning they're in good shape. I don't have a very LA physique. I'm not in great shape, but inshallah, if I keep doing stuff like this, I can drop 10, 15 pounds, maybe. That's my goal by the end of August. All right, that's what I'm doing. What do we mean by electronic media? Electronic media is when there is no physical product like a newspaper or magazine that goes from point A to point B. Anyone who wanted to buy a printing press or anyone who wants to buy a printing press and create a newspaper could, in theory, do so. There's no shortage of the number of newspapers that we could have in the world. It's not the same with radio and television. Radio and television send electromagnetic frequencies over the airwaves. I'm talking about the original model of radio and television now, not streaming and not cable. I'm talking about the original model of radio and television now. It's an electromagnetic signal that is sent over the airwaves. Because there's a limited number of electromagnetic frequencies, the government comes in and regulates electronic media in that way. We also have this situation where, and we've seen this before, technology develops much faster than the law. So rules and regulations develop from one form of media or one form of electronic media are often tried. They try to apply them to a newer form of media, and sometimes it doesn't fit.
The Titanic, here's where I explain how the Titanic, I think maybe you can see downtown LA behind me. Anyway, the Titanic relates to electronic media regulation in that that was in 1912. Around 1903, 1904, Germany organized an international conference because Germany was way ahead of everybody else when it came to wireless telegraphy. Germany realized that with signals crossing borders that the different nations needed to cooperate with one another. Otherwise, the signals from France and Germany and England would interfere with one another, the wireless radio signals now. Anyway, United States being United States, were like, don't tell us what to do. So the United States did not want to participate in this international conference. So the U.S. was relatively late in compared to some other industrialized nations when it came to regulating wireless telegraphy. Thinking of the Titanic sinks, people realized that there was a vessel close to the Titanic which had it was Marconi equipment. They had equipment, they could have heard the distress signal that was being sent, but the wireless operator had signed off for the night and wasn't working, so that the ship that actually heard the distress signals was quite far away and took a while to get there. It became clear that many more people, not everyone would have been saved, but many, many more people would have been saved from the Titanic had wireless telegraphy been more organized and regulated in a more efficient manner. So after the sinking of the Titanic, Congress passes the 1912 Radio Act, which was apparently already developed, kind of already on someone's drafting table, as it were. That motivated them to pass the Radio Act of 1912. The sinking of the Titanic motivated Congress to pass the first serious regulation of wireless telegraphy in the United States, which developed the policy of spectrum allocation, okay? The idea that different users are allocated different portions of the electromagnetic frequency comes from, and it begins with the 1912 Radio Act.
Okay, so just to be clear, if you are asked, hypothetically, if you are asked on a multiple choice question, what is the reason the government uses to regulate broadcasting? The correct answer is spectrum scarcity. Spectrum scarcity is the reason that the government regulates radio and television. Now we have a graphic here. This refers to this issue of spectrum allocation. I've already mentioned that two people cannot operate on the same electromagnetic frequency. Otherwise, it's going to cause interference. So the government, what this graphic right here illustrates is that the government literally portions off different portions of the spectrum and assigns them to different users specifically, and also different kinds of users, as it were. AM, FM radio operates on one portion of the spectrum. That's different than VHF television. That's different than mobile phones. That's different than satellite communication, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the concept of spectrum allocation. In the early 1920s, radio brought, there's no way I could do a history of radio lecture in a couple moments here. Give me 2 hours. Yeah, I'm your man, but I can't do it quickly. Anyway, there's a great deal of chaos, a lot of confusion. Radio stations are popping up all over the place in the early 1920s, and the government is really not equipped to handle them because the 1912 Radio Act, if you remember that, that was developed for the era of distress signals on boats. It wasn't developed for a system where people were using the technology to communicate publicly with radio and music. Okay, so there's a great deal of confusion. The government finally comes in, maybe a little bit late, but finally comes in and establishes a Federal Radio Commission, the FRC, Federal Radio Commission. The deal, and this is very important, is develop that if you are given permission, you don't own a frequency, but if the government gives you as a radio station permission to use a particular electromagnetic frequency that is yours and yours alone within a specific area, you have to operate that in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. Because we, meaning the government, are allowing you, the radio station, the exclusive use of a frequency, and it's a public resource. The airwaves are a public resource, so you have to use it in such a way that benefits everybody. There was almost immediately from the beginning preferential treatment for NBC and CBS networks. These are commercial radio networks that exist to make a profit and exist to sell commercials to people. A few years later, the FRC becomes the FCC. This was with the 1934 Communications Act, and the policy of the public interest mandate continues. Okay. I'm going to talk about that here for a moment. What is the public interest? Well, on one hand, you could say radio broadcasting has to be in the public interest. So it has to be something that's positive, beneficial, educational, going to help the country. Maybe it's not sexy. Maybe it's not fun. Maybe it doesn't taste good, but let's give people educational programming. I'm recording this in July 2025. Immigration's in the news. Let's do, informative documentaries about immigration, the history of immigration law. Maybe we should talk about the history of climate change and weather. Maybe we should talk about the proliferation of nuclear missiles around the world. Let's talk about Israel, Gaza. Let's, very informed, nuanced, detailed analysis of these topics, which are in the news a lot, so that when we live in a democracy, presumably. So when people go to vote, they can actually make educated opinion, an educated decision about something, right? That we know what we're talking about. That's the fruits and vegetables argument, that the public interest is whatever information is going to help society in the long term. Well, then there's another argument. Let's call this the candy for breakfast argument, that I don't want fruits and vegetables. My kid wants to eat marshmallows for breakfast. See, look at that image right there. Mash up some Kit Kats, put that in there with some chocolate milk. I'll bet that would taste good, right? The argument here is that the public interest is whatever the public is interested in. It's a very circular, see my circle? That's a very circular argument. The public interest is whatever the public is interested in. And maybe I want to know more about Meghan Markle and Justin Bieber's new tattoo and the Kardashians and just whatever kind of sleazy, salacious details can come out. Oh, there was this that the CEO that got his cheating scandal got exposed at a Coldplay concert, whatever, like just kind of like gossip. That doesn't really help people in the long term, and eating candy for breakfast is not in your best interest health-wise, right? I think we all know that we need to eat healthy. So it might taste good, might feel good, might satisfy some immediate need or something, but it's really not in your best interest long term. Historically, the government has favored the candy for breakfast argument. And by that, I mean the government has historically favored non-offensive, non-political, relatively mindless entertainment programming. And media outlets that offer that kind of programming are considered to be preferable to those that espouse a particular point of view or ones that have an agenda, even if that agenda could be educating children, providing a religious message, providing a pro-union labor message. Those kinds of specific points of view, which might be beneficial and necessary, those were considered propaganda, and those types of stations were given secondary treatment decades ago, whereas ABC and CBS were given better treatment. There still is the public interest mandate that has not gone away entirely, but it's not enforced nearly as much as it probably it should be. It never was enforced as much as it should have been. And what else would I say? Oh, yeah, it doesn't apply to streaming. If the public interest mandate exists, remember the number of airwave frequencies is said to be limited, right? Streaming channels don't use any spectrum. Cable also operates differently, doesn't use spectrum in the same way. So a cable TV channel, anything delivered over streaming, doesn't have any public interest mandate. That's very important to keep in mind. Okay, so individual stations get a license, which gives them permission to use a particular airwave frequency. These different stations, we call them affiliates. Almost immediately, they banded together and formed these networks. This graphic behind me is the NBC radio network from the late 1930s. I think my head is probably covering up Southern California, San Diego, and Phoenix. The license goes to an individual station. Networks are groups of stations that join together. They share programming through coaxial cable, satellite connections, fiber optic, whatever. They join together in some way and share the same programming and operate as one, distributing the same programming. But the license really goes with the local network station, the local station. So when CBS wants to put a television show across the country, there's a CBS station in San Diego, Phoenix, Milwaukee, etc. That is very important to realize. The network doesn't have the license, the affiliate has the license. And the affiliates are run independently as their own stations, and they do have some influence. Okay. What else does the FCC do besides enforce this public interest mandate? Well, those rules and regulations about a variety of things. I'm just going to touch on a couple tips of icebergs here. One of the areas they're concerned about is ownership. Okay. If we want a robust, thriving media industry and we want to have the media messages represent the full diversity of the United States, then we should probably have diversity of ownership. So maybe it's not a good idea to have one company owning 50% of radio and television stations in the United States. We want to make sure that women, we want to make sure people of color, we want to make sure that everyone is owning these stations so that we get a diversity of opinion. Historically, the trend has been to raise this limit. If it started with, okay, one entity can only own 7 or 8, it gets raised, Right now, as of this recording, I'm recording this in July 2025, right now, the idea is that the National Association of Broadcasters wants to eliminate ownership rules completely. The idea is that even if one entity owned every radio or television station in the United States, or maybe 2 companies owned everything, people could still get a diversity of opinion and a diversity of media content because they could always go online and find things on the internet. The internet has been perplexing and confusing the existing status quo, existing legal and economic systems for decades, and it still confuses things. I don't know what the rule is going to change right now, but given the current pro-business, anti-regulation regime currently in the White House, it's possible that the ownership limits would be scrapped completely. And I'll just show this other graphic right here. Look at this. Look at this evil octopus, right? Controlling. I made that image. I had that image made with one of these generative AI engines. And I said, give me an octopus controlling television stations in the United States. I didn't say make it evil. But those evil eyes, that AI put that in there. All right, now we have the fairness doctrine. This is a massive, massive issue, and you should definitely be familiar with this. This was a rule. It's no longer in place. That's the fundamental thing you need to know. The fairness doctrine does not exist. But it did exist for a couple of decades. In the late 1940s, the FCC said a television and a radio station, if it aired a controversial issue, it needed to air a variety of views about that controversial issue. Didn't have to put everything in the same program, but if you're a radio station and you're talking about, say, women's reproductive rights, you needed to actually put in some difference of opinion right there. Now, it was phased out in the 1980s under President Reagan. The conservatives, I repeat, the conservatives were the ones who wanted to get rid of this. There's a couple of reasons for getting rid of the fairness doctrine. You might say, Arsenault, this sounds great. Media should give both sides of an issue. That makes perfect sense. Well, it doesn't really make sense once you start to think about it. There is a rule against, or just a general provision against compelled speech. The First Amendment gives you the freedom to say what you want. It also means the government can't force you to say something. Okay. So we have this provision against compelled speech in the First Amendment. So if I were a radio or television station back in the day and I did a story about the evils of tobacco, you could not then, meaning you, the government, could not then come in and say, okay, now you have to air a story about the positives of tobacco smoking. And that I could kind of understand that argument as well. We also have this issue today where, unfortunately, absolutely every single thing you can think of is controversial. You can't talk about medicine and vaccines without people talking about the deep state and big pharma. Can't even talk about the weather. If I tell someone, oh, the weather's very hot today. Oh, I don't believe in climate change. I was talking to someone, my family, about NBA. I was like, oh, NBA finals, whatever, making small talk about sports, very safe topic to talk about. And one of my parents' mother said, we don't watch NBA. We're not down with all that Black Lives Matter stuff. Okay, so sports is controversial. Weather is controversial. There were even people who said seatbelts were controversial, and that when seatbelts were mandated, now you had to air a story about why seatbelts were bad for you. Anyway, point is that everything is controversial, so it would be hard to bring back the fairness doctrine. There's this provision against compelled speech, but the biggest reason that the fairness doctrine wouldn't work so well today, here's the biggest fundamental reason: it has to do with technology. The fairness doctrine was developed under this argument of spectrum scarcity. And we are forcing you to operate in the public interest because the spectrum is limited. Streaming channels don't use the spectrum. There's no spectrum to be used. Cable doesn't even use the spectrum. So the fairness doctrine would only apply to a small fragment of the media content that exists today. Not that many people even get over-the-air programming today. So for a variety of reasons, if you are ever asked, fairness doctrine would be very, very difficult to implement today. We have public broadcasting, at least we do at this moment. We may not much longer. I'm recording this in July of 2025. That is covered in the textbook, but at one point in the late 1960s, people realized that commercial media wasn't fulfilling all the needs and interests of American society. So we came up with radio and television stations that could really provide information without being concerned about advertising. There is no advertising on public radio stations. Okay, no advertising, zero. Now there is something called underwriting, but there is no advertising. Take a look at the textbook about Section 315. This means you have to give equal opportunity to people who are running for political office. All legally qualified candidates get the same opportunity for airtime on radio or television. Doesn't mean that a television station has to give it away. You can sell it, but when you sell it, you got to sell it at the same rate. So a local television station like local CBS in San Diego can't sell the Republican candidate for mayor airtime at a certain rate and charge the Democratic candidate more money, or the socialist candidate, or vice versa. You have to make airtime available to all legally qualified candidates for the same price, give them the equal opportunity. Now, there's this interesting situation here where the incumbent, I'm talking about a politician who's currently in office, is always going to have an advantage because this Section 315 doesn't apply to sort of bona fide news shows. Hypothetically, say I'm the governor of California. There's a fire. I go on TV to talk about the fire or some other natural disaster. People see me, they see my face. It sort of builds this connection. Governor of California, this person. Governor of California is this person. Now, someone who's running to be governor of California, they may have to pay to get their commercials on TV. But the person who's currently in office because when they're going out and doing their job, just in the course of doing the job as governor, they're theoretically they're said not to be campaigning. That's why whoever is currently in office always gets some type of advantage. And that's just the way the world works. But you should be aware of Section 315, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. It updated a lot of the rules that had already been in place, but also now tried to deal with all these new forms of technology that were coming out, including cable television, which had not existed prior. And wow, this is a big, massive iceberg, but cable TV doesn't use spectrum in the same way that traditional radio and television does. There's literally a cable coming into your home that delivers the programming. Because of that, spectrum is used is differently, and a lot of the FCC rules do not apply to cable. Also, don't apply to satellite television, which also uses spectrum. Now, there's something called multi-channel video programming distributors. I'm not going to ask you MVPD. You're never going to hear anyone even use the acronym MVPD outside of someone that's actually like a trade show or something like that. But this is the fancy official term for cable programming. Okay, so this develops in the 40s and 50s, really doesn't get big into the 70s or 80s. But there's this idea, and you should just kind of skim through the textbook, take a look at the concept between must carry and retransmission. The idea is that a cable company comes into a certain area, let's say San Diego, they take the over the air signals, which theoretically exist for free for the consumer. They sell that to the consumer along with cable channels which don't exist over the airwaves: ESPN, CNN, Comedy Central, things like this. Oh, there's also the Fox network on cable as well. So the cable company is selling you this big, attractive group of channels, including the local CBS, ABC, NBC. It's giving you the local channels as well. Those local channels theoretically should be available for free. The cable channel pays a retransmission fee because they're bringing you that content into your home. So there is a retransmission fee. There's also something called must carry, where I think a station can say, I don't really want money. You just have to carry me because I'm a local station. If you're ever, say, at maybe your parents' house or grandparents' house, because I don't think many people in JMS 494 watch traditional television. But say you're at someone's house and it's like, oh, I can't watch this channel because it's blocked out. It has to do with this dispute over retransmission and the fee, and the radio station or excuse me, the TV station is charging too much money. So just know that there is this concept of must carry and retransmission that's really into the weeds, but the FCC also deals with that kind of stuff. There are also these things called public access channels, which used to be much bigger in the 80s and 90s when cable was a bigger deal. There's these public access channels. These are a couple of channels that a cable company creates, and they allow anyone from the local community to come in and develop a TV show. The idea is that we're going to provide more locally oriented programming and maybe target some sort of small niche minority communities and things of that. You should be familiar with the concept of public access channel, and you should know for the exam what PEG stands for. Okay, that's in the textbook. The Supreme Court has ruled that the FCC does cover the internet. Okay, it's not explicitly stated, but the FCC does regulate the internet, not as much as traditional radio and television. You cannot transmit obscene content, anything that's legally obscene. You can't transmit that in any form or fashion. Okay. Now, there is something called net neutrality. I'll try and squeeze this in here at the end of this video lecture. The concept of net neutrality is that an internet service provider, if you're paying for the internet, which someone is, and your family, when you're paying for the internet, all the content should be delivered at the same speed. That internet service provider should not be able to prioritize content. The graphic behind me shows, lanes on a highway. Let's say everything should move. We're not going to have an HOV lane and then a slow lane. Everything is going to move the same. The idea here is that, say I run a blog for local San Diego sports. Hypothetically, let's call it 619 Sports, and I cover the Padres. Okay. I'm a very small operation. I operate out of my kitchen. ESPN is much bigger. ESPN is huge, right? ESPN could, in theory, pay
Cox Communications, internet service provider, they could pay Cox money. So Cox says, anyone who goes to ESPN gets that content immediately. You go to 619 Sports, it's going to come in very slow, like era of dial-up internet. It's going to take forever to load. Well, the consumer is not going to go to a slow loading page. That's going to give more power to ESPN and just help consolidate ESPN's dominance of the sports media industry. The concept of net neutrality would say that internet service providers have to treat everything the same. And that even if it's unpopular, even if it's small, even if it's a poorly operated website, it should load just as fast as Disney or Amazon or New York Times or anything. That seems to make sense. And I think that would help the First Amendment, because you're going to make sure that all opinions are delivered the same and we're not going to prioritize some or the other. The concept of net neutrality is a good concept. That policy no longer exists. That policy was phased out under conservative president. Okay. So if internet service providers did want to prioritize some content over others, I believe they could do so. It is a confusing issue because the laws change quickly. But this graphic behind me shows, someone made this years ago to show what would the internet look like without net neutrality. This theoretically could happen. $100 a month to access everything, that maybe is not a bad price with inflation. But the idea that you pay more for the internet based on what you're doing, people don't really seem to like that idea. But without net neutrality, we could be going in that direction. And it's a complicated issue and it keeps changing. Now we have Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This was part of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. This is the provision which people have been arguing about for years, okay? That an internet service provider, they provide content, they provide the sandbox. They're not responsible for what people do in the sandbox, right? That's the idea. That if someone posts information that is libelous, we know what libelous is. If someone posts libelous information on Facebook, Facebook is not responsible. If someone posts a death threat on X or Twitter is not responsible. The person who posted the original offensive material is responsible. But that internet service provider gets this freedom because of Section 230. The idea is that I'm not prioritizing some content over others. I'm not privileging some content over others. I'm providing just this open, level playing field, and that therefore the internet service provider or the social media platform are not responsible. Okay. All right. One more question, and then you're done with the questions. Stay tuned for some bonus film trivia at the end. Okay, stay tuned for some Los Angeles film trivia at the end. That's it.
Hello, students. This is the same day, a little bit later in the day from when I did the Runyon Canyon. I shaved. That's why the continuity doesn't match. I was looking a little bit like deranged street preacher there for a little bit, so I shaved the top part of the cheeks. Okay, that globe right there, it's the corner of the Paramount lot across from Astro Burger. I'm on Melrose here in Los Angeles. That globe was left over from RKO, Radio Keith Orpheum. That was a studio. It was formed by a merger of different companies. Radio Keith Orpheum. Now it's Paramount, and they kept the globe. And I love old Hollywood history. I love movies, and I love kitsch. I love stuff. So this is, like, to me, a great intersection. I'm actually going to eat at Astro Burger. Okay, I don't know if I've ever eaten there, but that's what I'm going to do. And this is now the end. This is truly the end of the lecture on Chapter 9.